All of us who were created have our story written within the tablets of life. Long before we were born and long after we die, the spirit in which we have self-created through our thoughts, intents, actions, and designs becomes the path in which we have chosen. The consequences of our self-design are encoded in the aspirations of our will. Our will being the spiritual compass guiding decisions that were made long before our ability to choose. In every way, the result of who we have chosen to be is a result of our decisions. Our fate was sealed long before our birth by us. Time is just a construction intrinsically built upon the foundation of death. Without death, there is no time. Without death, what is the value of life? If understanding death is a curse, is ignorance truly bliss? If death was the rebirth of our earthly karma, would we mourn the deceased? If you were kicked out of paradise, what would you do to make it back? Every spirit in this realm has an origin of creation. Just as spirits were created above in the heavens, spirits were created within the depths of the earth. Every earthly vessel that carries the breath of life or the stench of death has an origin of creation. As above, so below. As stated several times earlier, according to the top geneticists, geographic proximity plays a significant role in the differences between the races of men, followed by sexual selection. With geography playing a dominant role, the most logical way of analyzing the world's geography would be to use a method of categorizing the population of Earth most clearly based upon genetics. So in terms of race, genetics, and geography, the easiest way would be to divide the Earth into three predominant georacial regions: Eurasia, Africa, and America. And within these biogenetic geographical regions, the varying races of men embody similar characteristics which have specific places of origin. These places of origin do not necessarily represent the ethno makeup of the world today. Reason being is because populations have been removed, relocated, and racially infiltrated. For example, the racial makeup of present-day America includes a significant population not just of Indo-Europeans, but East Asians, South Asians, North Africans, Sub-Saharan Africans, Polynesians, and Pacific Islanders, all who immigrated to this land less than 50 to 100 years ago, whose families are not indigenous to America. Yet, these groups actually own a larger part of indigenous land than do the indigenous people. The colonial swindle designed to control the world begins with the will of whom the heathen nations were created, the fallen. the defiant spirits of the earth who have been eternally relegated within this plane. Those whom cause men to err, the armies of perpetual death. What is dead may never die. The demons of death walk amongst us, and amongst them, when we walk in their ordinances, we walk into the abyss of tormented souls, never returning to the divine light of wisdom and righteousness. The genetic invasion of the heathen nations would dramatically alter the landscape in a very short amount of time. For the Gentiles who arrived on the shores of America needed no armies. Their weapons were biological. They carried plagues of pandemic proportions, more so than any ungodly intention brought forth by the heathen. Their mere presence was death to the original people. These people, who lived amongst horses, sheep, pigs, and dogs, were created with the immunity to certain diseases carried through contact between man and beasts. The empires of ancient America withered under the parasitic transferal of bacteria, which led to the biological genocide of millions of indigenous people, effectively annihilating the enormously powerful empires of America, one infectious boil at a time. Conquering through contamination, they have used deceptive words and violence to acquire their means for power and control. These deceptive words and works are created as a tool to fabricate ownership, not just of money, land, and resources, but of the souls of the righteous, who are promised, through their earthly strife, eternal peace. Yet there is no peace nor rest for the wicked. Only more grandiose designs of deception motivate the depraved objectives of the treacherous merchants of death, for which there is no refund. Part of these designs take place at the academic level. At the top universities in the world, historical gatekeepers are Freemasons and Jesuits who pervert all of the accepted information that the world accepts as fact. For example, if you were to research world ethnology maps from the early period of colonialism up until the Civil War, you'll notice that every ethnological map of North and South America, the original people are not included in any manuscript. In addition, Indo-Europeans have already pre-written their ethnological dominance long before they had become a significant part of the population. Even today, with an increased number of Indo-European descendants living in America, these old maps would still be dramatically inflating the numbers of Caucasians living in America today. The main reason the Caucasian can even consider themselves a majority in America and not a minority is because they use tools like the census and racial classification as a method to promote color identity classism. For example, light-skinned Latinos or any racially ambiguous person is motivated to consider themselves white or Caucasian in any situation in which colorism may benefit them. Within the mestizo population of Latin America, the identity crisis is more than just skin deep. Much of the indigenous population of Mexico, Central and South America has been pushed so far into the fringes of society that if you never saw them, you would never know they existed. When most people think of an indigenous South or Central American, they are thinking of a Paleo-Mongoloid. According to anthropologists, this population of people can be traced to Siberia. This is what the Beringia Theory is propped upon. The migration of the first people in America is said to have taken place over the land bridge from Siberia to Alaska. Their accepted narrative promotes this theory as truth. This information has been propagated for centuries, and those who appear as Asian are just as complicit as those who appear as European, as there were agreements to deceive, divide, and conquer. As stated previously, Europeans and Asians are the same genealogy, with their progenitors coming from the Caucasus region of Central Asia. Genetically, everyone on the continent of Eurasia can be traced to the same progenitors out of the Caucasus. And this even includes the darker races of Australia and the Pacific Islands, all of which are the same family, which means all these different skin folk are actually kinfolk. And these kinfolk dominate a large portion of the continent of Asia. Northern Africa is populated by groups classified by anthropologists as Hamite Caucasians. These populations are mixed quadroon and octoroon groups that were a result of intermingling between humans and Neanderthals with hybrid ape-like creatures. Just as in geography, sexual selection played a major role in the development of the modern human. And a result of that sexual selection is hybridization. So although two monkeys could never procreate a human, no matter how many millions of years the theory of evolution says it needs to create a new species, the only way for a monkey to become human would be through the process of artificial selection, selective breeding, geographic isolation, and finally, hybridization. We know for a fact that Neanderthal DNA is predominant on the continent of Asia, with East Asians and Pacific Islanders having the highest amounts. We also know that another genetic strain of DNA dominates certain areas of Asia as well. Anthropologists classify this stream as Denisovan DNA. The unique quality about Denisovan DNA is that it exists pretty much all over Asia and virtually non-existent on the continent of Africa. The most archaic remnants of DNA remaining to be studied draw specific genetic parallels between apes and the progenitors of the Caucasian and Mongoloid races. Could there be any truth to that part of the theory of evolution? We know that after the fall of Babel, certain men were turned into apes and elephants, while others were scattered. But is there any biblical proof that such ape-like races of people ever existed? Book of Jasher, chapter 36, skip ahead to verse 29, Anah feeding his father's asses. And whilst he was feeding his father's asses, he led him to the wilderness at different times to feed them. And there was a day that he brought them to one of the deserts on the seashore, opposite the wilderness of the people. And whilst he was feeding them, behold, a very heavy storm came from the other side of the sea and rested upon the asses that were feeding there, and they stood still. And afterward, about 120 great and terrible animals came from the wilderness at the other side of the sea, and they all came to the place where the asses were, and they placed themselves there. And those animals from their middle downward were in the shape of the children of men. And from their middle upward, some had the likeness of bears, and some had the likeness of kephas, with tails behind them from between their shoulders, reaching down to the earth, like the tails of the Duke Chiefeth. And these animals came and mounted and rode upon the asses and led them away. And they went away unto this day. And one of these animals approached Anah and smote him with his tail, and then fled from that place. And when he saw this work, he was exceedingly afraid of his life, and he fled and escaped to the city. And he related to his sons and brothers all that had happened to him. And many men went to seek the asses, but could not find them. And Anah and his brothers went no more to that place from that day following, for they were greatly afraid of their lives. In the book of Jasher, chapter 36, Anah had brought his father's asses to one of the deserts on the seashore, opposite the wilderness of the people. When he was there, he beheld a terrible sight. Great animals appeared to him. In the sight, Great animals appeared to him in the likeness of half men, half beasts. In his description, Ana recounts figures that are reminiscent of a minotaur or any hybrid from Greek mythology, except for the description in Jasher is opposite the portrayal propagated by the purveyors of Greek mythology. Instead of the head of a human and the body of an animal, these beasts had the heads of animals and the bodies of humans. As described in Jasher, Ana was located on the desert on the seashore, opposite the wilderness of the people on the other side of the sea. The implication here is that there is another wilderness on the other side of the sea, opposite the wilderness of the people. The phrase opposite the wilderness of the people makes the implication in combination there is a wilderness on the other side of the sea in which people do not live. Learning what we have about geographic proximity and sexual selection, if the wilderness opposite the wilderness of people could be represented by any of the three major continents, which continent would that be? The book of Jasher, chapter 60, states that Zepho, grandson of Esau, fled Egypt and came to Africa and was received with great honor. How does one leave Egypt and arrive in Africa if Egypt and Africa are supposed to be the same place? From chapter 60 through 63, Zepho, grandson of Esau, traveled frequently between Africa and Chittim, which is identified as an island in the Mediterranean. How is it possible to never have run into Egyptians while during the service for King Angeas? At the time, Africa was under the control of King Angeas, and what most people consider the location of ancient Egypt is less than the distance from San Francisco to LA. Yet, we are to assume, through the bastardized version of the modern map, that Zepho, as well as Angeas, traveled between Chittim and Africa, but never got held up by Egyptians. Furthermore, why are Egypt and Africa considered two different places? How is it possible to never have run into Egyptians while during service for King Angeas? At the time, Africa was under the control of King Angeas. And what most people consider the location of ancient Egypt is less than the distance from San Francisco to LA from Chittim. Yet, we are to assume, through the bastardized version of the modern map, that Zepho, as well as Angeas, traveled between Chittim and Africa, but were never held up by Egyptians? Furthermore, why are Egypt and Africa considered two different places? The families of those lands were the progenitors to the Greek through the line of Japheth. Zepho, through the line of Esau, would eventually come to rule some of those lands, with his sights set on returning to Egypt and making war against the sons of Israel. Many of the current rulers in the lands of Japheth are some of the most powerful families in the world, and much of the wealth and power they've acquired is stolen directly from the children of Israel. The children of Israel at the time were under the yoke of the Egyptians, who had, after the death of the sons of Jacob, begun to exploit and oppress his descendants. Also, they had stolen the lands that the family had acquired during the lives of Abraham, Jacob, and even Joseph's land in Egypt had been stolen. Rikayan, the first pharaoh, devised a plan to charge families an established price to bury deceased family members. Jasher goes on to say that Rikayan had spoken so wisely that he persuaded King Osiris, who had originally delivered him in anger, to allow him to become a high-ranking member within the kingdom. From that point forward, Rikayan would administer justice and govern the people, and the king would only judge the people once a year. By this method of institutional manipulation, Rikayan was able to usurp the government and tax the people. This just happened to be around the time of the famine in Egypt. Rikayan hired a small army and then held up the mausoleum, extorting mourning families out of their loved ones' final possessions. This is how he acquired power and wealth. It is stated that he was called Pharaoh because he exacted a tax from the dead. And from that point on, rulers in Egypt would be called pharaohs. Quote, as the Phoenicians were famous as traders, it has been supposed that the name Canaanite is a synonym of merchant. In certain passages of the Old Testament, the pursuit of trade, however, was a characteristic of the maritime cities of Phoenicia and not of the Canaanitish towns conquered by the Israelites. Canaanites were originally associated with merchants. Who were the Canaanites? The Canaanites consisted of more than just the lineage of Canaan who dwelt in the land of milk and honey. In addition to a Canaanite being relatively indescribable physically from any other group, the traditions and customs were as broad as their appearances seemed to be. One thing can be gathered from a consensus of biblical interpretations. The appearance of a Canaanite was considered racially ambiguous. According to Ann Kilbrew, archaeology professor at Penn State, Canaan was not made up of a single ethnic group, but consisted of a population whose diversity may be hinted at by the great variety of burial customs and cultic structures." End quote. These customs were the abominations written about throughout the first books of the Torah. As mentioned several times during the course of Scripture, beginning with Genesis, Canaanite women were to be sworn off, and marrying a Canaanite woman was considered an abomination. The abominations of the Canaanites included, but not limited to, witchcraft, magic, sorcery, communication with dead spirits, worship through ritualistic orgies, temple prostitution, sacrificing children to demons for earthly favors. Who would be considered Canaanites today? Much of the issues surrounding the ways and the customs of the Canaanites centered around morality and the sanctity of creation. Many atheists have proposed the question, if God is so loving, why did he command the Israelites to destroy the Canaanites? The same spirit would ask, if murder is a sin, why would God command murder? The spirit that would ask this question would have no moral objection to spiritual perversion of the highest order. To this spirit, death is its creator. Within the earth, it shall return again, again, and again, until the day of consummation, when the only mercy is death, the only thing promised to those who transgressed, as first written, the inescapable, the far from final. Death. Many of us were created by the Most High in the heavens, finely designed and conceived through the inception of our will into a world of wickedness that preys on our iniquities in order to consume the souls of the righteous. The wicked neither aim their will to virtuous objectives, nor the workings of the heavens, nor the writings of our prophets. The wicked were born within the earth with the purpose to cause men to err. But what are the differences between these men who walk the face of the earth? Modern geneticists say that humans share a significant portion of their DNA with apes. But who are they referring to? Studies clearly have shown that at some point in time, interbreeding between men and beasts had taken place in Central Asia and Siberia. They also say that before this, an ape-like hominid creature migrated out of Africa and began the process of interbreeding. One simple point is missing from this rhetoric. This entire process begins with interbreeding between species, aka sexual selection. The accepted rhetoric gets lost immediately upon the first interaction between a Homo erectus and a Neanderthal, which is recorded in Central Asia, as well as discoveries of a variation of humanoid ape-like remains in Siberia that verify sexual relations between Neanderthals and Denisovans. None of these species are human or man. They are mankind or men-like creatures, which all existed and walked the earth. Deuteronomy mentions a nation that are not a people. Leviticus mentions the acts of the nations that defiled the land. Of these acts, men and women lay with beasts, to which Leviticus 18:23 calls confusion. Confusion on its etymological surface, meaning uncertainty, disoriented, or perplexed. These are actually the consequences of confusion. The phonetical meaning takes on a more fitting definition as it pertains to Leviticus. Con meaning negative or to negate, and fusion meaning bond. Confusion, a negative bond, the bond between man and beast. These sexual abominations of bestiality and incest were prevalent in the land of Canaan. These are also parallel to the ways and mythologies of which continent of people? If a significant portion of the darker nations in America and Africa have 0% Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA, would those populations be considered man or mankind? Does the continent that your ancestors inherited after the fall of Babel determine your spiritual origin? Is one's spiritual origin its final destination? These questions and more on the final episode of The Smartest Beast in the Field.